And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing the next system down here that will be bringing the strong winds, heavy rain into especially the southern southeast coast during the day tomorrow, slowly moving northward. Way down in this position here, the low center barely onto the chart there. Dry, light winds interior Alaska into the Bering Sea. This Arctic front spreading some snow into the northwest part of the state, mostly from the Brooks Range on up to the Arctic coast, but some of that getting down to the Bering Strait. And still gale force winds here for the Alaska Peninsula out of the north into the eastern Aleutians. And for tomorrow, that's low center slides eastward there, bringing gusty winds to the eastern Arctic coast with snow extending along the front back into the Chukchi Sea and the Bering Strait. Mixed precipitation in the Seward Peninsula due to the southwest, warmer southwest winds here with this next low. And that front bringing high wind warnings to the southern panhandle, gusts 60 miles an hour, and gale warnings 35 to 45 knots there along the outer coastline. Lighter winds, lighter precipitation up to the north and back to the west here. And then for Wednesday, still some gale warnings on the south coast. They're still pretty rather windy, but not like tomorrow with this next front that moves in as the low center coming northward here continues to weaken. This low center bringing snow and eventually colder air with it into the northwest interior. They'll overspread all of the interior later in the week. And then this cold front here bringing a chance of snow into Norton Sound, Yukon Delta, but it'll be pretty light whatever does fall. And the next system bringing wind and rain into the central Aleutians. For tonight, or I'm sorry, for Tuesday, southeast coast or the southern panhandle, the south coast of the panhandle, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots, gale warnings there, gale warnings for Clarence Strait for Tuesday, southeast 35 knots, seas 13 feet, southeast 20 with gale force gusts for Stevens Passage, and south 15 for Lynn Canal. Central coast here, east winds 30 knots, seas 11 to 16 feet, and for the north coast, east to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots. And for the north coast on Wednesday, northeast winds 20 knots with higher gusts, central coast here, east at 30 knots. And again, gale warning, especially along the coast of Prince of Wales Island or along the coast of Prince of Wales Island. From the south at 35 knots, seas down here still up around 20 feet. And south 25, gusts 40 knots for Clarence Strait, while Stevens Passage, southeast 20, gusts 35 knots. Lynn Canal, south at 15, seas 3 feet. Prince William Sound tomorrow, northeast winds 15 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east-northeast 20 to 25 knots, seas 7 to 8 feet, northeast at 15 for the western North Gulf Coast. And Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, seas 3 feet, and northwest 20 knots for the Barren Islands, north 20 for the Barren Islands, and Kamishak Bay, northwest winds at 20 knots. And then gale warnings for Kamishak Bay on Wednesday. West winds 35 knots, turn northwest 35 across the Barren Islands. And Cook Inlet, mostly north winds 10 to 20 knots, seas 2 to 4 feet. Prince William Sound, north winds at 15 knots. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, not too bad wind-wise, north to northwest at 15 knots. Northwest 25 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island tomorrow, north winds 15 knots, seas 3 to 6 feet. Bristol Bay, north winds 20 knots, seas 5 feet. In the Alaska Peninsula, north winds 25 to 35 knots. And then for Wednesday, south side of the peninsula here, the Pacific side, still looking at small craft advisories, northwesterlies at 25 knots with those seas down to 4 feet. Bering Sea side, west at 20 with 7-foot seas. In Bristol Bay, small craft advisories, west winds 25 knots with 7-foot seas. Kodiak Island, west-northwest, 25 to 30 knots, seas 5 to 9 feet. On Alaska Island, tomorrow, gale warnings, north winds 35 knots, 7 to 13-foot seas. Around the Kolsky there, north 25 to 30 knots, lighter winds for Adak and Atka from the northwest at about 20 knots. And then small craft advisories for the western Aleutians, Kiska to Shimia, those winds will be south at 30 knots. And then for Wednesday, south to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots here for the western Aleutians. Gale warnings also for Adak and Atka with that front pushing in with rain and south winds sustained at 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians here, south to southwest winds 20 to 35 knots with seas running 5 to 11 feet. And small craft advisories for the southwest coast, for the Yukon Delta coast, northwest at 25 knots for Tuesday, north 30 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, Pribilofs, north at 25 knots, and then southwest 25 here for St. Matthew Island. Lighter winds for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, northwest at 15 knots. And then for Wednesday, Norton Sound, small craft advisories, 25 knots out of the west, and St. Lawrence Island, west winds at 20 knots, southwest 20 for the Yukon Delta coast, west 25 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southwest 25 at the Pribilof, seas there about 7 feet, northeast at 30 knots with 11-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, west winds 15 knots, north winds 15 knots for the western Arctic coast, turning northeast at 15 for the central Arctic coast there. And then the far eastern Arctic coast, west winds 30 knots, but for the central areas here, Prudhoe Bay area, east winds at 25. Then on Wednesday, westerly winds 20 to 25 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west at 15 on the central coast, turning northeast at 10 for the west side, and then northeast becoming northwest 25 to 30 knots for good small craft advisories for the Chukchi Sea.